right, so I am Cheryl Court. I am with the Coalition for Smarter Growth. Thank you for joining us this evening. I am the Policy Director for the Coalition for Smarter Growth, and we are putting this event on in collaboration with Ward 3 Vision. And Ellen can introduce herself later. Regarding that, the Coalition for Smarter Growth is the leading nonprofit in the Washington, D.C. region, advocating for walkable, bikeable, inclusive, transit-oriented communities as the most sustainable and equitable way for the DC region to grow and provide opportunities for all. Ward 3 Vision is a group of residents who imagine Ward 3 neighborhoods as even better urban places, more walkable, sustainable, and vibrant. We've convened this event tonight to start the conversation about how zoning can be reformed to make both building more homes more affordable and available, while also ensuring neighborhood-friendly buildings and great public spaces. Emerging approaches to zoning offer simpler rules for creating great places while reducing delay, uncertainty, and the cost of new housing. We've organized this into introductory program with a kickoff discussion about the zoning code and how it can help us design walkable communities, and how really examine how zoning is not doing a good job to address these needs. And we see this as both a discussion for the city as a whole and also the region. And it's especially important, we see, in high-cost neighborhoods, as well as less affluent neighborhoods where a developer can try to get away with cheap and poorly designed building. And that said, we want to turn this event over to Ellen McCarthy, who's on the faculty of Georgetown University Urban and Regional Planning program, and former director of DC Office of Planning. And Ellen is also a member of Ward 3 Vision Steering Committee. So Ellen will be moderating this event tonight. After we hear from our speakers, Ellen will lead a discussion with them. And then after that, we will open up for questions and discussion with the audience. Ellen, please take it from here.
Okay, thanks, Cheryl. Good evening, everybody. Thanks for setting aside the time to join us and learn a little bit more about alternatives to zoning. Clearly, we need to provide more and better housing options for our neighborhoods. Our residents come in all ages and sizes and family situations, but in many areas of DC, their housing choices are generally pretty limited to very large and expensive single-family detached houses, or very expensive newly constructed high-rise apartments, or those new high-rise apartments with the preponderance of efficiencies and small one-bedroom units, or a limited small set of older rent-stabilized apartment buildings. But our housing shortage contributes to serious problems with being able to afford a place to live. And since our city has very few large vacant areas in which we could build new housing, it seems clear that part of the solution is to be able to use land more intensively. But the question is how to do that while at the same time creating or maintaining vibrant, attractive, walkable neighborhoods. In some neighborhoods, new construction is almost non-existent, partly because of neighborhood concerns about new construction block approvals, partly because concerns about new construction block approvals, and partly because developers and lenders fear being held up by lengthy disputes, legal disputes, in addition to vastly increased costs for construction. So current zoning practice has been fingered as a major culprit in this situation. And I thought, to make sure we're all on the same page, let me just briefly define some terms. Conventional zoning, or sometimes called Euclidean zoning, for the Supreme Court case in Euclid, Ohio, that originally held that it was a legitimate public power for a municipality to divide itself into small areas or zones. And it was largely based on the principle of keeping incompatible uses away from each other. So originally that was pretty clear. Slaughterhouses ought not to be in the same district as residences. But eventually zoning was even prohibiting useful things like corner stores from being in neighborhoods. So while these zones are primarily concerned with uses, they do actually deal as well with form to a certain extent. Largely just aspects like the minimum size of a building lot, building height, setbacks from the property lines, and what percentage of the lot can be occupied by a building. An important thing to keep in mind, though, and one of the limitations of zoning in terms of making for great neighborhoods, is that zoning only applies within property lines and does not include the public space. So an alternative to this kind of zoning is, and one that relates more to the character or form of the area, is known as form-based codes or form-based zoning. It focuses more, as you might guess from the name, on the form of the built environment. And since your experience of the quality of a place is not just the character of individual buildings, but how the buildings relate to each other and to the public space, form-based zoning aims to provide a better overall character and also makes it easier to understand what new development would look like and how it would fit in. So basically, when we look at the existing system of zoning, we realize, well, what we'd really like to get from zoning or what kinds of changes we'd like to see are, sure, we still want to see appropriate uses in appropriate places, including being able to mix uses that make sense to mix, like residences and small retailers. But we want to also create great places, and that includes public space. For citizens, the rules and the potential results need to be clear. Like when new zoning is, residents and businesses want to know what a development will look like when new zoning is being considered. And reading a dry document that says new buildings will be no more than 3.5 floor area ratio with a lot occupancy of 80% and height stepping back at a 45-degree angle from a plane 20 feet high in the rear, that's just not the clearest picture. So likewise, potential developers need the rules to be clear so they can obtain the financing to invest in creating the kind of neighborhood that prospective renters or buyers want, without fear of adjacent neighborhoods tying up construction for years due to suits, basically based on the fear of the unknown of what the new built environment will actually look and feel like. Zoning needs to be clear enough about what is desired that potential developers can proceed with knowing that as long as they meet the requirements, they can go ahead without lengthy discretionary processes. So tonight's speakers will address ways that we can achieve vibrant, walkable neighborhoods with new or slightly modified approaches to land use regulation. So our first speaker to address that is Matt Bell. He's a professor of architecture and urban design at the University of Maryland School of Architecture, Planning, and Urban Design. He's a fellow of the AIA and the Congress of New Urbanism, serves on the DC Historic Preservation Review Board, and is a member of Ward 3 Vision. He's also a principal of Perkins Eastman Architects. Projects that he's been involved with that our audience might be most familiar with include the Cleveland Park Library, Dunbar High School, and the public spaces at the Wharf. Not sure if that included the design of the grill your own s'mores section, but he also was involved with the Reservoir District, formerly known as McMillan Sand Filtration Site, where he worked on both the master plan and the community center. So Matt, take it away.
Okay, thanks, Ellen. Let me share some slides here since I'm an architect, and I can't really talk without pictures. Let's back up to the beginning here. Okay. Ready. Screen 2. Share. Okay, good. So I'd like to share with you some thoughts about a little bit the evolution of how design was controlled, a very short history of that, to make better public environments. And I know one of the things that Cheryl talked about was housing and the need for housing. I think one of the things that is at the heart of a lot of people's concerns about building, more housing in the form of apartment buildings and things like that is to make sure they get good-looking buildings. And I share that concern as well. And I think what I'd like to share, even though I'm not going to talk explicitly about housing, talk a little bit about the evolution of the way some form-based zoning has worked over time, give a couple of examples far away and near to us here, and then talk a little bit about what some of the issues are in DC specifically as we move forward with thinking about things like this and what sort of changes might be possible. So really a little bit of history and a little bit about the art of the possible. Okay, let's see, what am I doing? Good. A lot of people think medieval cities were organic and they just grew organically. In actual fact, medieval cities were, because I teach architecture, I always have to start with history. Medieval cities were highly controlled, and there were laws about where you could build and where you couldn't build, and how big a tower you could build, and where you could have a tower and where you couldn't have a tower, and things like that. And particularly in places like Siena, they made people even cut the towers off of their buildings around the Piazza del Campo in order to give prominence to the communal building of the Palazzo Pubblico. So there was, throughout history, we have had cities that have been regulated and controlled through their form and through what they look like in terms of their aesthetics. This was also true in North Africa and in the Arab world. Many of the cities we know, the great Casbahs of places like Tunis and Casablanca, were subject to very strict urban design controls and form-based controls based upon Islamic law. In some cases, you could only have windows in the upper right that could overhang the street so far, or the shop seller could only use so much of the street to put their wares out. Or in some cases, the street had to be wide enough so that a man loaded with merchandise on a camel, that two people could pass each other without much trouble in the street. And it was all based upon how people lived in cities. Of course, as well, what was important to these cities was the fact that high levels of privacy were maintained so that people couldn't see into each other's houses. But it was really very much a form-based approach. Closer to home, when the English colonialists established Alexandria, they were very much interested in making Alexandria a thriving port, partly because they wanted to be able to tax the merchandise that came through in and out of Alexandria and have a city there for all the infrastructure that was needed to be able to accommodate merchandise and all the things that go along with port activities. The state of Virginia, they had tremendous problems. The English Crown had tremendous problems establishing cities in the state of Virginia, partly because there were so many rivers that were navigable and people could get merchandise to other parts of the world without really having to bring it into a city. But when Alexandria was planned, and this is one of the early plans of Alexandria on the right, it was a simple grid with all the streets the same width except King and Washington streets, and they were the ones that were a little bit wider. Now, we know a little bit more of Alexandria today on the left side as sort of a thriving, 18th century, 19th century colonial town, and we're used to walking up and down the streets, many of whom have nice buildings with wonderful proportions and terrific details. But it wasn't always that way. And in fact, when they first founded Alexandria, John Carlyle built his house in Alexandria, and it was a freestanding house. It didn't make a street wall. It was a sort of urban version of Mount Vernon. And what they realized, if they continued to permit people to build the way John Carlyle was building, that they wouldn't have a city. So what they required was, they said to people, okay, we're not going to allow that. Your buildings, if it's a private building, has to be built with a facade on the street wall. If it's on a main street, it has to be complete within 2 years, and then a secondary street, 3 years, and a tertiary street, 4 years, and so on and so forth. It has to be part of a street wall, and the ridge line of the house has to be parallel to the street, so that it could be distinguished from civic and public buildings where the ridge line could make a gable, and they could have a very different kind of presentation and therefore be identifiable as public buildings. So it was a very simple way to control the form, but in the end of the day, what they were able to do was actually get a town, and they had struggled mightily in terms of town founding throughout history in Alexandria, but what resulted is the beautiful city that we see today. Jumping ahead a few hundred years, New York City had a problem in the early 19th century, 20th century, excuse me, when the skyscraper became a very important feature of the skyline, and the elevator and steel construction was sort of bursting on the scene. Developers were building buildings straight up from the street wall, like the Equitable building on the left side, the Flatiron building in the center, and also the municipal building on the right side. And there was a sense that these buildings were going to be very detrimental to the health of the city by blocking light, air, and sunshine down into the city streets. So what they did was they invented a zoning code, probably the most inventive zoning code ever made in the history of zoning, that modulated the relationship of the tall part of the building to the street wall. And you can see the diagram on the left side, where you can see all the different setbacks that were required as part of this zoning. There were parts of the building that could go up in the center of the block as long as the setbacks were met, as far as they wanted to build. But as the building met the street wall, it stepped down. Now, don't get me wrong, nobody's proposing high-rise buildings for any place we might be talking about like this in New York City. I just want to make that clear. But I do think it's important to understand that one can use the regulations to support the way buildings ought to behave on the street wall, and ought to be able to be good neighbors to one another, and good neighbors in terms of creating a good urban setting. So in New York, on the right side, they had a code that limited, that had setbacks every so often for how high the building went up. And depending on where you were in the city, you could go up 1 times the street width, or 1.5 times, or 2 times the street width. And they also had regulations, land use regulations, the first comprehensive zoning really in the United States that regulated the height and bulk, as well as the land use in the city. And what ended up really was a kind of form-based code, and a very distinctive style to the buildings that you see in Manhattan. And repeat, this is not me up here saying we ought to do exactly like New York, but to say learn from the kind of lessons that New York shows in terms of managing height, bulk, setback, and the availability of light, air, and sunshine. That can all be designed into a regulation. And in fact, in New York, it yielded some very, very good buildings. Here's a building, 5-story building, built after the zoning code that would be appropriate in any part of, I think, our cities today. It's handsome. It does all the things it ought to do. It makes beautiful ground level retail. It makes a beautiful sort of middle part of the building, and a nice top, and a significant entrance. And when you walk past this building, your general experience here is of the way in which the building presents itself to the street. But the building is in fact the Empire State Building. And when we're standing and walking through Manhattan, and we realize that what the 1916 zoning code did was it gave tall buildings the ability to break their scale down and relate to the street in a way that makes beautiful and harmonious streets, which really is the most important obligation of any urban building, to be able to define the public realm in a way that it adds something positive to that public realm. It's not about the overall height, it's really about the building behaves down street level. Washington, D.C. did copy some of the zoning in New York City in the decades after the New York City zone was established. You can see here, this is a map from 1936. On the left side, you can see Wisconsin and Connecticut Avenue. You can see the commercial districts of Connecticut Avenue articulated different from the residential districts. They're in different colors there. And that sort of regulation was very, very common, more or less based upon what New York had done decades earlier. So, do we have form-based design in DC? Well, I would argue that we have some aspects of that. For example, we see very, very few above-grade parking decks in Washington, D.C. One of them is at Union Station on the left. Most of the parking that we see is experienced like this, a big door, and we drive down into a parking garage below a building. And the reason for this is because Washington, D.C. decided very smartly, I think, way back when, that all development above grade would count towards the allowable FAR or right that you could build above grade. So if you had the right to build, you know, say 200,000 square feet, and your parking was, you know, 50,000 square feet, you could only build 150,000 square feet of something else. And, everybody knows that you can really make more money leasing apartments and building office buildings than you can storing cars in the sky. So most of the parking in Washington, D.C. goes underground. So that is a kind of form thing. It forces the parking into a location that makes it more palatable. And you really see very, very few above grade parking structures for this reason in Washington. The other kind of form-based design we have in DC is in historic districts. And on the left side is a map of historic districts in Washington. There on the right side is a building we did a couple of years ago, Collection 14 on 14th Street, which was part of the 14th Street Historic District. And the way that the Historic Preservation Review Board operates is it judges compatibility of buildings with the preponderant characteristics of the district. So the Office of Planning does a study, articulates what the characteristics of the district are. And when a building comes in for review for HPRB, then we take into consideration how those characteristics are expressed or understood or developed in the design. And in our case here, we incorporated a number of historic buildings and made a facade that we felt was compatible with many of the characteristics of 14th Street. And it had a major setback in the middle. It had highly articulated vertical aspects. We didn't want a building that was too horizontal because that was not like what you found on 14th Street. And the side streets in the area tended to have residential bay windows. So we did that on some of the side streets to be compatible with those streets. And the building today is a residential retail and also has a meeting space and some office space in it as well as part, and contributes, I'd like to think, in a very positive way to the historic district. But that is a kind of review process that is adjudicated by the Historic Preservation Review Board. Now, we also have by right design, and that really is one of the things that I think we're challenged by, which is that by right design is design that has doesn't have a review process other than whether or not it meets zoning. So zoning really talks about its height, its FAR, and setbacks, and very little else. It doesn't undergo reviews for compatibility or anything else. And sometimes I think we end up with public environments that suffer a great deal because the by right design doesn't really give us much in terms of the character of what a piece of architecture could be. And much of our downtown is by right design, and a lot of the buildings, the reskinnings and things that have been done down there, I think are yielding buildings that are very, very harsh for the public environment. And by contrast, these two projects, both of which I greatly admire, are in historic districts with the very same program as the buildings I just showed, except they underwent review to be compatible with the historic district. So the 16th Street Historic District on the left, and a building in the DuPont Circle Historic District by Hickok Hall there picks up on the color of the buildings nearby and the scale and the proportions of the openings. And while it still has a lot of the kind of both of them still have a lot of the characteristics one would find of office buildings in terms of the amount of glass, I think there are scalar elements and things that relate them well to the context. And I think they both fit in quite nicely. So what is the art of the possible? So I just want to touch on three different ways that one could move forward thinking about what might be considered for revisions for DC. Form-based code, modified large tract review, and design guidelines enforced by the Zoning Commission. So one of the most well-known national examples of form-based codes is the Columbia Pike form-based code, which was started in the early 2000s. Columbia Pike was a very, very suburban style street on the left side. They did a great number of charrettes and workshops and came up with a form-based code, which was illustrated in the center about what the code would yield in terms of materials and heights and how the buildings behave at ground level. And then on the right side are some of the built realizations. And there are four parts to a form-based code: the regulating plan, urban standards, architectural standards, and street standards. The regulating plan deals with things like, where parking goes and where new streets might be, the types of building frontages, the types of buildings that might be built there and where the public space occurs. The urban standards talk about setbacks, yards, things like that. The architectural standards talk about things like percentage of windows, kinds of roofs and roof pitches and overhangs you can have, sometimes going into detail like colors and materials, depending on how detailed you want to get to deal with how the building behaves. And the street standards are about different kinds of streets, boulevards, avenues, streets, alleys, and how those things behave, and what are their widths, what are their sidewalk widths, what kind of planting goes on them, and things like that. And that's what's been adopted at the Columbia Pike in Arlington. These are some pictures there of some of the buildings that have been built under the code. The building on the left side, you can see the code requires expression changes every so often and things happening at the corners. On the right side, the code also is very specific about places where heights need to change to be able to be compatible with adjacent residential neighborhoods. So you can see there's a 5-story building on the right that steps down to 2 stories plus a dormer because that's a residential area just beyond it. So there are very nuanced ways that a form-based code can begin to be compatible with the context around it, aside from controlling how the buildings look and materials that are used, but also in terms of their massing and height. We do have one kind of form-based code at Hill East, which is a code that Ellen and I participated in many 400 years ago, which was the rebuilding of the DC General Hospital site. This is under construction today. This project is by Donatelli. Here it is a HE2 code in the DC zoning book, and it is the form-based code is illustrated with examples of how the building should behave and the kind of materials and expressions that they should enjoy. And I think the first phase of this has been rather successful in terms of bringing a very, very different kind of character to this area, which just down the street is the DC jail and the DC correctional treatment facility. So what are the pros and cons here? The pros of a form-based code, it's very prescriptive, it's very predictable. So you spend a lot of time working out what things are going to look like. Sometimes people, it raises the bar of a minimum level of quality. In other words, you're guaranteed not to go below a certain level. There's a level of surety. Developers like it because it's predictable, and if they meet the code, they get approval. So the approval process is efficient. And it can also be very site specific and make adjustments, like I said, to residential areas. Some of the cons are some people believe it's too prescriptive in terms of the kind of architecture it engenders. By the way, most form-based codes do not code public buildings like libraries and schools, just the private buildings. Sometimes they can be, some of the architecture maybe can be a little bit of average quality, maybe doesn't necessarily always inspire great masterpieces. It takes a little bit of time to modify a form-based code. We're in the middle of one now on Columbia Pike about what some of those modifications might be. But it does take a while to create it. You have to be very specific about what it is you're looking for and be able to model those things and show people exactly what it will result in. The second option is the modified large tract review. And this is not a process that results today in an approval or a denial. It's an administrative review by district agencies and the affected community to identify issues and provide feedback to the developer of a by right project prior to applying for a building permit. It serves as a way for a developer of a large tract of land to receive comments from city agencies and the affected ANC early in the planning and design process of by right projects. It's required when there's a minimum of 3 or more acres, but it's minimum of 3 or more acres can be subject to large tract review, but at 10 acres or more, it's required, or a commercial or mixed use development exceeding 50,000 square feet in area, or the subdivision is on a site of 3 to 10 acres in size, I should say, yeah, acres in area. This is what's currently on the books, and this is when it's not required in certain zones. It is also subject to zoning commission approval, and it must be filed before a building permit is filed. So what would it assess? consistency with District of Columbia laws. It does also assess potential traffic and neighborhood impacts, design impacts, and quality of life and environmental impacts. It could also be part of a mandatory review. That could be a change that's reviewed at the Zoning Commission for large tract review. And it also could be adopted in designated areas, perhaps without size requirements. So those might be considered. It does engender a design review. It is already a DC process, so it could be modified. And also, one of the things that helps it speed up a little bit is that there are joint reviews by the agencies reviewing projects. It would have to be modified, so there would have to be considerations of this minimum site area, whether that would be eliminated or reduced, or sites designated for large tract review. And right now, it's not currently binding, so it's not an option if you want it to be binding at this point. And it could include incentives. The last one is design guidelines for the Zoning Commission. And this would be develop guidelines for designated areas where, similar to what the Office of Planning, Historic Preservation staff does for historic districts. This would be accompanied by a staff report and a recommendation by the Office of Planning. Just like at HPRB, you would receive a recommendation from the professional planning staff. There would also be ANC input, and that would be of great weight, like PUDs and projects in historic districts are listed as landmarks. But final approval would be with the Zoning Commission, much like a PUD. But also, it could also include incentives for participating in the process. So those are three ways we've sort of talked about different considerations that one might put forward to really engender better control over design and better outcomes in terms of design as something that provides for really terrific public environment.
Okay. Thanks, Matt. I think we'll hold the questions and discussion till after both of our speakers do their presentations. And we are thrilled to have as our next speaker, Toccarra Nicole Thomas. She is the Director of Land Use and Development at Smart Growth America, where she leads the recently launched Center for Zoning Solutions. So, all right, we have a workshop and we have somebody who's in charge of zoning solutions. What could be better? She has a master's degree in urban planning from the University of Florida, and she's had a number of planning-related positions in Northern California. She also, at Smart Growth America, led the writing and publication of the HUD-sponsored Community Compass Guidebook, Eliminating Zoning Barriers to Affordable Housing, an actionable guidebook for practitioners around the country to unlock affordable housing supply at all income levels by eliminating zoning barriers. That's among her many activities at Smart Growth America. So, Toccarra, give us a good background in form-based codes. Thanks.
Ellen, I appreciate that. I am going to share my screen, which everyone is doing, but I have to say it aloud. And then we will start the conversation. Slideshow, sorry, you all. All right, not gonna go through all of this, but I am with Smart Growth America. We are a national nonprofit based in Washington, D.C. Our North Star is we envision a country where no matter where you live or who you are, you can enjoy living in a place that's healthy, prosperous, and resilient. And we accomplish this through our impact model of thought leadership, advocacy, and technical assistance. We have three programmatic priorities: climate change and resilience, advancing racial equity, and healthy communities. All of these programmatic priorities are a through line for all of our work, and each and every thing that we do at Smart Growth America touches one or all of the programmatic priorities. I'm not going to go through my background again, but we will share these slides out with you all. I don't know why it's making me, sorry, you all, I'm having some technical difficulties. My slides keep going without my permission, but I apologize for that. So this is just my background, just really kind of giving a fine point. I am a planner. I've been a planner my entire life since I was a little girl, before I even know what planning was, right? I used to play this game called SimCity. And I absolutely loved it. And I like to think of myself as the Swiss Army knife of planning. If you can think of it, I've done a role in planning. And I'm absolutely a policy wonk through and through. And I absolutely love housing. It is my why. All right, so moving on. I do want to talk a little bit about the Center for Zoning Solutions. We previously had the Farm-Based Codes Institute, we being Smart Growth America, and we sunset the Farm-Based Codes Institute very strategically. We felt we needed to kind of pull back a little bit and look at all the potential zoning solutions that a community can put in their toolbox to unlock their community's true potential, right? The vision for the Center for Zoning Solutions is a country where every community has implemented equitable land use policies that support people to live, work, and thrive no matter where they call home. We have 3 big priorities for the Center for Zoning Solutions: writing and implementing codes for today's communities, advocating and supporting more housing in the right places at the right price point for everybody, and supporting a people-centered movement to help advocate for these tools and these ideas and solutions as well. All right, so that's all my commercials. I had to tell you my background, tell you about my company a little bit. Now I want to get into the actual meat and potatoes of my conversation. How can we actually tap into zoning to unlock walkable communities where people can have a house where they want to live, have access to their everyday destinations, their everyday activities, so on and so forth. So I want to start the conversation with a really big headline that walkable communities are desirable, especially with housing diversity, and they see a price premium. They pay less for infrastructure and reap more financial benefits throughout time. Some couple of statistics I want to throw out to underpin this conversational piece. From the National Association of Realtors, they found that for every single family house that is sold, that injects approximately $110,000 and 2.9 full-time jobs into the local economy. For multifamily housing units, the National Association of Home Builders found that for every 100 multifamily units that come online, there's an average of 161 jobs, and about $11.7 million is added to the local economy in the first year. This also supports an average of about 44 jobs and generates $2.6 million each year once the project is complete. At Smart Growth America, we found that communities with smart growth approaches such as form-based codes generate more tax revenue for local governments. We saw within the cohort an average of $65 million across the cohort. And we also saw that rent stabilized even with increased growth and increased residents. And then the last thought I want to throw out is in our Foot Traffic Ahead report, which was published in 2023, we found that throughout the pandemic, housing prices in walkable urban places skyrocket, which indicated that there was a favorability and a demand for more of these types of places. So really just kind of putting a very fine point on it, that communities with conventional zoning, they're essentially leaving money on the table if their zoning precludes housing supply and housing affordability. All right, so what is the form-based code? I'm not going to belabor this point too much because Matt did a very excellent walkthrough of the form-based code and some of its applications. But I really just want to underscore that it is a set of land development regulations. It's not a policy, it's not a guide, it's not an aspiration. If it aligns with the standards of practice, it is a legally binding regulation. We focus more on the outside of the buildings, hence the moniker form. And then we include those standards for both public and private development. And it really a true form-based code that advances the vision of the community, allows for that rich by right development. By right just means that you can build it without having to go through extra review cycles or discretionary review. And it helps to ensure that a community's vision for how the built environment should look is actually developed. The conventional zoning, one of the really big key differences is that it focuses on density and regulating density and trying to maintain single family detached levels of density throughout a community, whereas a form-based code focuses on building form and lends itself really readily to redevelopment and infill and small scale development such as duplexes, tiny houses, accessory dwelling units, while also allowing for single family housing as well. It allows for that rich gradient of housing types that makes communities a great place to live, work, and thrive. So what that means, how would an existing neighborhood develop over time with a form-based code or with some of the elements and approaches that are outlined in a form-based code? You can create and adopt a menu of desired housing types. Start by identifying kind of those cool, unique, quirky houses that are already in your community as the baseline for the menu. Maybe thinking through what are some of those historic structures or those places where people will tend to come to a neighborhood or a corridor to see those types of structures. That kind of is the baseline. That's where you want to start when you start thinking about what are additional housing typologies that can go into your existing neighborhood and fit with those existing types while also building upon. A real life example of this is Claremore, Oklahoma. They adopted an infill development program with the elements of a form-based code to accommodate that growth of the existing neighborhood character. And it is outlined a menu of allowed housing types. On the far left of the screen, you can see a flex house, which is a 2-story, 1,800 square foot building, a single cottage, 1 or 2-story building, and then a walk-up of 12 individual 1-bedroom units in a 3-story wood frame building. Really, the key takeaway for Claremore, Oklahoma's program is that they started with an existing neighborhood. They work with their community to determine what are structures that would align with the existing neighborhood. And then they also created a dialogue of what could be future housing typologies that could be allowed in the community. Adopting a pedestrian scale public space standards, wow, say that 5 times fast, to create your community's living room. I do want to dig into this one a little bit more. We want to think of the green spaces, the civic spaces, the community spaces as the living room of our communities. And we want to take the time to intentionally design that and put those elements down on paper, so to speak, so that when development does continue to come in the neighborhood or corridor or an existing neighborhood, these public space standards provide that outdoor living space for all people in your community. On the far right side of the screen, you can kind of see a graphic which illustrates some of the elements that can be included in these standards. Maybe thinking through, what does a cafe zone look like, a pedestrian zone, landscaping and furniture, really paying attention to including those people-oriented infrastructure such as benches, bike lanes, shade trees, awnings, and things of that nature that make it comfortable to walk around the community. Also think about your parking. Where are you going to allow parking? If you're going to allow parking, can that parking be enhanced by including planters alongside the parking spaces? And then finally, thinking through a shared travel zone. Really, we want to also kind of incorporate all mobility modes while prioritizing people instead of prioritizing cars. You can use a form-based code to retrofit large land masses and even corridors. This graphic kind of looks like what a community or large-scale land mass can look like over time when a form-based code is applied to it and it develops according to that form-based code. A real-life example of this is the Canton Village Districts Code in Connecticut. Canton Village won the 2019 Form-Based Code Award, and it was applied to a commercial strip along State Route 44. They intentionally included higher density, mixed use development, and they also broke the corridor up into 3 district villages, which they really kind of looked at each node of that corridor and identified what makes each node a unique character, and then wove everything together into one big master form-based code for this corridor. On the top right of the screen is the Mount Laurel apartments, which recently came online along the Route 44 and was one of the first developments that came out of the pipeline from the Canton Village District Code. It is characterized by high density and allowing for a mix of income types within this development. So meaning you can see some low income, higher income, moderate income units without identifying which unit is which. We also want to think about our small businesses and protecting them. We want to allow for smaller and more flexible business street frontages. the front of the building that goes on the street and where you typically enter the building. Winooski, Vermont is a good example of that. Their form-based code really focused on allowing smaller than usual business frontages, which they felt would allow affordable spaces for small and local businesses to come out of the pipeline. Another example I want to kind of talk through is the state of California. The state has essentially upzoned all of the residential zones throughout the state by allowing all housing typologies in all residential zones and housing in some commercial zones by right. On the screen, I put some graphics of what that density could look like in a community that's already established. On the front, you see some structures that are typically about a single family size, but if you look a little closer, and I apologize, it's a little hard to see, you can see some of the differentiations. Some of these are some mixed use and duplexes, triplexes, but they all look like a single family house. Then in the back, you can see what it looks like if you allow for additional units. So you can see an attached ADU here, a detached ADU, a garage that's converted into an ADU. And in this one, it's a little faint to see, but it allows for a basement conversion. This is what you can see or think of as that gentle density, where you're allowing for more units on one formerly single family large lot space. And then here you can kind of see this is what it looks like in real time. This is an accessory dwelling unit behind a primary residence, single family house in Seattle. So how can you support these approaches? This is an iterative process, and we all have some responsibility, not just us policy wonks and practitioners. All of us live in communities, and all of us bear the responsibility to help ensure that our communities are as walkable and affordable as possible. So you can educate your neighbors, educate your fellow residents, tell them about the pros and cons of adopting the form-based code, the pros and cons of allowing for additional affordable housing units. Address legitimate concerns if they pop up. Addressing legitimate concerns is very important, because if you just kind of just dismiss somebody just because it's a concern, it can lead to some friction, which can help delay the process. Testify at and attend public hearings, especially when walkability or affordability or smart growth approaches are the topics of those meetings. Signal boost past work, share good examples that you've seen. And then finally, thinking through your language matters. I didn't include this as a slide, but there's a difference between affordable housing, subsidized housing, and market rate housing. Affordable housing just essentially refers to housing that is affordable to anybody based upon your income level, whereas subsidized housing is a little bit more defined, and it refers to housing that is subsidized either via Section 8, voucher, of something of that nature. But the reason I wanted to take the time and walk through those differences, typically in the general nomenclature, when someone mentions affordable housing, they're typically referring to subsidized housing. It is really important to tease out these nuances, because if we're using the incorrect terminology, it can derail a conversation. And then again, as I mentioned earlier, it's iterative. It continues, it never stops. Once you adopt the zoning text amendment or the form-based code, you can continue having these conversations. So my little cheat sheet, if you don't walk away with anything else from this conversation, create and adopt a menu of the different kinds of housing that can be built by right throughout the neighborhood. You get bonus points if you make sure that these housing typologies are near everyday destinations, such as a daycare, grocery stores, jobs, recreation, educational facilities, so to speak. Think through prioritizing people over cars. We want to make our corridors pleasant and safe to walk while decreasing speed naturally. We can do this by allowing buildings to use more of the parcel. This is a policy wonk speak when you talk floor area ratio. Allow for a range of building heights, bring your buildings closer to the streets, and put parking in the back. You can get extra bonus points if you consider shared parking between different uses. And then also installing people-oriented street infrastructure. Those are your bike paths, the benches, the green spaces throughout your community, while also focusing on eliminating blank walls along corridors. I'm thinking through if it's a big, large, boxy building and it's on the street and it has a blank wall. Things like that can help, can stymie walkability and can stymie that visual interest along corridors, which can also sometimes increase speed naturally by drivers. So doing these things can kind of create a pleasant view shed for all and will naturally decrease speed by drivers moving through the corridor. Create your community's living room by developing and adopting those pedestrian scale public thoroughfares. Identify, and you can do this by identifying your desired activities that you want to see along that corridor, thinking through walking, bicycling, driving, public transit, and then the community's social life. And then ensuring that those uses are enshrined in your code and that those uses are also scaled for humans and not cars. Protect your small and local businesses by allowing for redevelopment of existing structures with the focus of form over use. This is really, really impactful for small businesses. If you can allow them to quickly take over and rehabilitate an existing structure, that helps decrease its costs, which allows them to reinvest those costs savings back into their business and help ensure the health and viability of those small businesses. And then finally, last but not least, adopt a neighborhood and or a corridor specific form-based code. We don't necessarily have to adopt a form-based code for the entire city immediately. While that is a gold standard, we can focus on a neighborhood or a corridor and develop those contexts over time according to the community's vision. So that's my cheat sheet. These are my social handles, how you can reach us at Smart Growth America, and my contact information. And I'm going to stop sharing and turn it back to Ellen.
Okay. Oh, thank you so much, Toccarra. Those graphics were really helpful for understanding form-based codes and their various different manifestations. I know one thing that is confusing to some people when they look at the possibility of form-based codes is the advocates for form-based zoning always say there's a difference between form and design, and form-based zoning is not decreeing a design. But I think that's hard for people to sort of understand the distinction. So could you explain a little bit about that?
That's a great question. And I would say that form and design should go hand in hand. And it's also ticking on one of the other critiques of form-based code about its prescriptiveness. I kind of colloquially think of a form-based code as like a cookbook with different recipes, and you can pull from different elements of different recipes to make a meal for a dinner party, right? Now, if I'm taking this analogy and applying it to design would kind of be like the seasoning. It might feel like it's you can not use it or something like that, but if you don't use that seasoning, your meal is not going to be tasty, right? So kind of taking that analogy, the prescriptiveness of a form-based code allows for that design to shine through with a really strong emphasis on community vision. A true form-based code absolutely has to be baked in your community's vision, or else it's not going to survive. That's how we're able to be prescriptive, and that's how we're able to kind of walk away from the discretionary review process a little bit, because we've taken the time up front to outline the vision for the community with the community's partnership and then put it on paper.
So in that instance, design would be more related to the types of materials, the specific types of fenestration or whatever, but the actual shape of the building and the block that it's in and the public realm in front of it, those are all things that would be subject to form-based codes.
Yeah.
Okay. And Matt, I know you were trying to find some sort of middle ground or some alternatives, given how complex the development of regulating plans and form-based codes could be. talk a little bit about your third alternative with the using design guidelines in conjunction with the zoning that maybe addresses form more broadly. I think you were talking about an analogy somewhat to what the Office of Planning and Historic Preservation Review Board did with regard to Woodley Park and Cleveland Park.
Yeah, I think this is a very interesting possibility here, which is work with the community to develop guidelines that emphasize what's important. Talk about the character of places. Character is very important, certainly when historic districts are nominated and made. There's a great deal of discussion about what are the features of that historic district. But one could also do this outside of historic districts. You could say, well, there's a certain area where we really want to focus and make a really great design, because, you know, things might be different tomorrow than they are today. In other words, we may be anticipating taller buildings, we may be anticipating infill and things like that, but let's find a way to control that such that there is both the preliminary prescription about what should be there, and then also the judgment by professionals about whether or not it meets the criteria of the guidelines. You know, the HPRB guidelines only judge compatibility. One could even go much further with design guidelines and go beyond compatibility. It could talk more about things that one might find in a form-based code, but maybe doesn't, you know, and of course, there are different levels of form-based codes. It's not like they're all the same in terms of what they cover. But you could have something that is a generally agreed upon design guideline framework for an area. It is, you know, reviewed by the community and the ANCs and get input and things and written up and illustrated. And then when a project comes in, you know, if the project's in the area, there could be a report written about it, an evaluation by someone at the Office of Planning, and then a recommendation as to whether or not the project meets the design guidelines or not, as they have been written. And that would go to the zoning commission. And the zoning commission would then decide whether or not to support the staff report in terms of what its recommendation is. And, you know, they could support it or not support it, or they could send it back and say, well, it needs to do this and it needs to do that. It is you know, one of the things I've experienced too is that when neighborhoods, you know, and zoning changes and there are things like buildings are proposed to be taller than what's existing and things like that, understandably, people, you know, assume the worst case scenario because lots of times that's what architects give them. So I think what this sort of thing helps people do is be more predictable up front and weigh in a way that helps articulate what they'd like to see and what they think would be good additions to their neighborhood, rather than just leaving it to by right zoning. It's a bit of a wordy answer. Sorry about that, but
I'm sorry.
it was a bit of a wordy answer. Sorry.
Oh. But, you know, you're an architect. What do we expect? So one of the places that we're looking at what kind of new zoning could be applied is Wisconsin Avenue, and with the design framework, you know, and also Rhode Island Avenue and some other major corridors. But I know, for example, the Wisconsin Avenue plan called for pocket parks in particular areas. And when you did the regulating plan for Reservation 13, you did identify a site as identified as a park. And it was zoned as such when the final zone was put into effect. Of course, it was a lot easier because it was publicly owned land.
Yeah, all of Reservation 13, Hill East, was publicly owned land.
Yeah.
So we could make things as we chose. When the land is privately held, the only way to get those kinds of things is to offer incentives for people to be able to have public spaces. The form-based codes do specify those things about where public places should occur, and you can do that in a form-based code, but also it's trickier when it's on private property.
And Toccarra, do you have any examples of things like that where privately owned land becomes dedicated to public uses as part of the code? And are there incentives applied to sort of make that work?
Yes, it could be done both ways. Kind of like stepping back a little bit from my experience with um, especially green space, but other types of community amenities. If it's not in the code, it's not going to get built. So that kind of speaks a little bit to the mindset of regulating the private properties. But that's more of like a proactive when you're doing it before. If you're applying it on a retroactive basis, Matt is 100% correct. There's a lot trickier, and you really have to start digging into some of the incentives there. But like, so generally my ethos there is try to make sure as much is in the code as possible so that you can have a regulatory leg to stand on when you try to ask for those things. There's also some other interventions such as like payment in lieu of fees, where if a developer wants to get something else, they'll contribute to a fee for those fees for a fund for green spaces. That's more of like a general, a specific community where they have adopted these types of, I guess, regulations to obtain these community benefits, like green spaces. I want to say Winooski, Vermont, that was another part of their form-based code that stood out to us when we were reviewing it for the form-based code award a few years ago. Riviera Beach, Florida, which is a small coastal community. They have that in their form-based code, which is their community redevelopment agency plan. Yeah.
Okay. So with respect to affordable housing, the terminology is one that is sometimes confusing to people. Generally, I think in DC, when we have talked about affordable housing, it usually means publicly subsidized affordable housing, as opposed to housing affordability or housing attainability, which is more broadly by building new developments or making them available at lower price points. We expand the eligibility of who could get those units, but they still are less expensive than typical new luxury high-rise construction, for example. What kinds of provisions have you seen in form-based codes that specifically call for that kind of increased affordability, whether it's publicly subsidized or just at lower price points?
A lot. I'm trying to pull up the one that I really specifically want to drill into, because they made it a cornerstone of the form-based code to have community benefits agreement that were specifically tied to affordable housing, and thinking affordable housing, whereas housing attainability with some considerations for subsidized housing via incentives. And that community is, you all just bear with me for 1 second. I want to make sure I get the correct name of that community. Goodness, I can't find it. That'll be one of the things that I can share out after the webinar recaps. I don't want to take
Okay.
up space, but there's a specific community that actually went through that exercise and enshrined community benefits via affordable housing. And the way they did it, they added density bonuses as part of their form-based code for communities, the high rises that will allow for a range of income types. And then they did it by percentage base. So for every so many percentages that you included for affordable housing at certain levels, they gave you an extra floor or two.
Okay. So before I open it for general questions, did Matt or Toccarra, did you each have, either of you have questions or comments for each other?
Well, only to say that, I think one of the things that is always a challenge is form-based codes in existing contexts, not in greenfield conditions. And, I think there's a lot of, I talked about New York. I think there's a lot of lessons because that was an existing context that they went into. and invented a way to rethink the skyscraper, so it was more human and more compatible with, you know, how the city was growing. I think, you know, there are ways to manage the relationships of buildings to the streets that still promote growth, but also give us, you know, the light, air, and sunshine and all the things we value in terms of our neighborhoods. You know, and I think the three ways I outlined are things that really ought to be carefully considered. You know, I know a lot of folks believe that having a historic district is the only way to have any kind of design review. I think if we're creative, we can probably come up with a number of different considerations that would work equally well. Because remember, historic district is only looking, historic preservation is only looking at compatibility. You know, and I think there's probably some of these issues that deal with, you know, changes in the sizes of buildings and new zones and things probably go beyond that as an issue.
Right, and I think you were also mentioning the ability of, say, a zoning commission to use bonus density to reward people who adhere to design guidelines or open space requirements or affordability requirements or other things that could be specified within the code, so everybody knows what the trade-offs are ahead of time.
Right. The developers like incentives. They like that, you know.
Yeah, generally.
But I think the thing you said, Ellen, just now is important. Ahead of time. In other words, one of the things about PUDs is that they're negotiated as you go along. Now, the ANC may have a list of things they're looking for and stuff. This could put a certain amount of surety in terms of what the community is looking for, so that when a developer is coming in with a project, say under option 3, design guidelines for the zoning commission, there could be a list of incentives that go along with what community needs are as well. I mean, one of the issues recently has been with the diminution in the number of PUDs that are being done. The community benefits have also evaporated, because many PUDs come along with community benefits in significant ways. So I think this might be one way to get some of those benefit packages back.
Right, without the uncertainties of discretionary processes where somebody buys a piece of property and doesn't know what it is that they're going to have to provide as part of getting development permission. Toccarra, I think you had a question or observation.
Well, just I guess extra closing thoughts. I love the form-based codes, not because we advocate for form-based codes, but I love the predictability, the transparency, and the applicability. That's all the illy words. The applicability, it can at any scale. We have seen a lot of them come through as greenfields, but it is designed by nature to allow essentially any, no, I don't want to say any, you can more easily develop an existing structure under a form-based code if it aligns with the standards of practice versus a tear down rebuild under conventional zoning, right? And really great case stamps, like a rich cache of case studies are in Florida. Almost every single redevelopment agency in Florida has a form-based code as its redevelopment plan. And a lot of them are starting to see units come out of the pipeline. So that's all redevelopment, all rehab of existing structures, right? So if it's grounded in the standards of practice and it's grounded in the community's vision, what we found via the zone-in reports, the developers love the predictability. They love the fact that they can come into a community, it's already outlined in the plan, and they don't have to fight a bruising discretionary review process for something that's already allowed. Now, that's not to say that the community doesn't have an opportunity to weigh in, because A, we did all this upfront community visioning to develop the form-based code, and then B, there's still opportunities, especially in DC, to continue to provide feedback. But it helps cut through some of that NIMBYism, just to use that phrase, and I know it has a lot of negative connotations, but it still applies. It helps cut down those louder voices that might be opposed to any type of development, any type of housing, and gives everybody a chance to have their voices heard. and for the community to truly advocate for what it wants.
Terrific. So want to open up questions and answers to the audience. If you have a question, you can go down to the bottom of your screen to the React heart that's there and click on recognize on hand, raising your hand, and we can call upon you to ask your question. Ellen Bass.
She might need to unmute herself.
Right, that's what I'm
Yeah.
trying to do.
Okay, yeah, you're unmuted now.
Okay. The last point that Toccarra made, and then Ellen picked up on it about giving incentives to developers for more affordable housing. Don't we have that in DC with the IZ? Don't you get more density if you can put in more IZ? I remember this being raised with respect to the glass building on Connecticut Avenue, that people were unhappy about that because they got more density because they put in more IZ apparently. Is that what you're talking about? Do we already have that here?
Well, we have inclusionary zoning. If you meet, there's percentages of units that have to be made affordable, and they're affordable at various levels that are specified in advance. And you get bonus density to
Right.
roughly compensate for the whatever additional cost comes with building the units as affordable. That's a baseline, and with the IZ plus, inclusionary zoning plus, calls for actually increasing that for buildings that now will have increased density. So that I think we were talking broadly in general about incentives for increased density. In DC, we have that provision, and I doubt that it would be substantially modified for the future. Although something like the Wisconsin Avenue design framework encourages developers not just to meet the standards of inclusionary zoning, but to do that with greater percentages of, say, 3-bedroom units to make them more attainable for families. And those might carry with them additional incentives if a developer chooses to do a larger number of bedrooms instead of just efficiencies or 1-bedrooms. Okay, Laura Richards, you have a question?
Thank you. I enjoyed the presentation. My question goes to applying using form-based zoning in a city that has very few large lots. Most of our lots are like less than 5,000 square feet. I mean, and the large lots, 1A, are just a very, very limited supply. So how do we apply form-based codes in a city that's already pretty kind of crowded in its housing?
Okay. Toccarra, you want to address that?
I think that's a fantastic question, and it goes back to the different scales of a form-based code. I've seen a form-based code applied to a single parcel all the way up to an entire county. So you can, I hear you, that's a very valid point that DC has a variety of lot sizes. But if you take like the specific corridor in Wisconsin, you will start with what's already there. So somebody will go out and identify all the different parcels that are already existing and identify all the different lot sizes. Then you will build upon that. So you'll try to, how to use it, right size the code so that you don't get like a Manhattan sized skyscraper next to a single family house. And I'm just using that as an example. Understand that this particular corridor we're talking about has a variety of uses. So you can dial it in to the specific needs of what you are seeing.
You know, a lot of it's based on frontage, how the buildings front the street, and the extent to which, if it's this wide of a building, it has to do this. If it's this wide of a building, it has to do that. I think a lot of it has to do with how the building defines the edge of the public realm, and that's street frontage. And, I think I think your observation about very few large lots left is an interesting one. I don't have that feeling, actually. Developers are clever at consolidating things, and we've seen a number of buildings be torn down. I mean, for example, the building at Friendship Heights, the mall there was torn down and rebuilt, a rather large project. I'm even forgetting the name of it now. Why am I?
Mazda Galleria.
Mazda Galleria, yeah. So there are projects like that, and I think it is worth thinking about what the frontage is and how you want the building to behave on the street.
I think another interesting example is the sort of hybrid that from the zoning that the Office of Planning prepared and was recently adopted by the Zoning Commission for Upper Connecticut Avenue, in which you mentioned, Toccarra, one way to preserve spaces for small businesses is for them to be able to buy and rehab a property. But another thing that the Office of Planning did, and I think we actually suggested or certainly supported it, was that if a block gets redeveloped, that the ground floor in an area where we want to promote or retain existing retail is that at the retail level, it has to be able to be broken up into smaller pieces. So it's not just only suitable for a giant CVS or a chain store, that the shop windows have to be there, the entrances, the ways to make it
Well,
not.
what you're talking about, Ellen, is the public environment people like are main streets that have a lot of different stores on them.
Right.
And sometimes when places get redeveloped, the leasing agents want to have as few tenants as possible. So instead of dividing 50,000 square feet up, they find a 50,000 square foot tenant. And you have to be very careful about that.
And
Right.
I'll jump in here, and that's where the beauty of the form-based code comes in. It can protect your existing main street. It can create new main streets. It can create sub-corridor main streets. It's really what the community wants. And I really want to belabor this point, because small businesses are so integral to local economies. I saw a statistic, and I'll try to dig it up and share it out, that in a local economy, small businesses contribute almost a third of a local economy. So when we are designing our communities and we're designing these buildings and we're putting, what we want in our form-based codes, that can help protect those small businesses and protect our local community economy.
Great. Dennis Sendros, you had a question?
Hi. First, I want to thank you for the presentation. This was very educational, and I really appreciate it. I think, DC's suffering from a housing affordability crisis, as I'm sure that the speakers would probably agree with. And building more here is beneficial, and I agree with the point that they made about giving developers more certainty up front being beneficial to developers who want that certainty, who want to be able to build. But I can't help but, and I'm confused about this part, right? Because you've talked about form-based codes as being really about where the building meets the public realm, and about the frontage, things like that. But it also sounds like a lot of these form-based codes also govern the use of the building itself. The diagram that Toccarra put up talked about a cafe zone, which seems to be like, I think, what Matt sort of called like the quote-unquote old zoning. I'm having trouble not reading this as more requirements put on developers in order to build, rather than increased certainty. Because like under a by right design, those form-based requirements don't exist. The use-based requirements still do, but it's, they still get to build as long as they meet use-based requirements. So I wonder if you could clear that up for me. This is the trouble I'm having.
Yeah. I think I understand your question. I had some background notes, so I missed a little bit of it, but I think you want to get clarity on the uses versus the form portion of a form-based code and how that applies to developers and the level of prescriptiveness. Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, sort of. And you know, what is this not just more requirements being labeled on top of developers? I mean, that's sort of like how I'm reading it. It's just like, in addition to all the use requirements, we're now going to layer design requirements on top. And I think that, I don't think that's the point you're trying to make. So I'm trying to get to the point you're trying to make. And I'm hoping you can clarify that. Yeah.
Thank you for the opportunity to allow me to clarify. That is not my intention to say that at all. Before I answer that question, I want to give a little quick anecdote. When I was the deputy director of a community in North California, my zoning ordinance, conventional zoning, had 185 articles. To get an answer to one question of what can I build on my property, I had to consult at a minimum 10 different articles. I'm a planner. I've been a planner my entire life. Even with my background and a very strong county attorney, I couldn't give you an answer. Now, comparing that experience to a form-based code, we're attempting to streamline and simplify all of that legalese and all of that text, kind of like the running joke amongst us. If my grandmama can't understand what is in this form-based code, we hit it out the park. So it's not that we're necessarily trying to add more regulations. It's what we're trying to actually simplify it and clarify it. Now, putting to the side, there are some examples of form-based codes out in the world that don't align with the standards of practice. And essentially they are conventional zoning codes with graphics and charts. That's not a zoning code. That's not a form-based code. It needs to be clear and easily readable in clear language. There are some use categories, but they're more categories versus a wall of text. I've also seen like 30 different examples in a zoning code to explain what is a hotel. So instead of trying to account for every single potential possible use and then write out every single potential development standard and every single potential regulation that goes along with it, it's more streamlined where it's like, hotel, here's what it should look like. Here's where it can go. Here's how it should interact with the public realm. Sorry, y'all, my words are kind of leaving me a little bit. So just to wrap up, because that was a really long example, it's more of providing clarity, ease of readability, and condensing some of the more onerous regulations into something that is more streamlined.
I think what Dennis is asking is, do the requirements of a form-based code drive the cost up of affordable housing? And I think one of the things that would be important for any community to do if they embark upon a mission to either make a design guidelines or form-based code, whatever it is, I would talk to the developers and show them what you're thinking and what you value and get their feedback. And see what things that they think they can do and what they can't do. Now, the good ones will be honest with you, because the good ones want to build good architecture because they're looking to the next project. They don't want a scorched earth policy. They want to be able to have a good reputation and build in a lot of different places. But I think these sorts of endeavors do require input. And my experiences with developers, they want to follow the rules if it gets them a quick approval. They want the rules to be fair, and they're willing to give you input in very specific ways. So that's one thing I would recommend.
Right, and just to add also, Dennis, it goes back to this notion of what does the developer know ahead of time. So form-based code doesn't mean one doesn't pay attention to use, because obviously if you're applying a code as a zone to a Main Street area where you want to encourage ground floor retail with residential above, those are uses that you want to specify. But if there are also design requirements or form requirements that have to be met, as long as the potential developer knows before they purchase the land what is going to be expected in the way of amenities, affordability, whatever, that makes a big difference. It was one of the reasons why when I was at the Office of Planning and we originally just were relying on negotiated proffers in PUDs to get increased affordability or affordability commitments from developers. When it was proposed that we make inclusionary zoning part of the matter of right, part of the zoning code, we realized, oh yeah, because if somebody has bought a piece of property not knowing what it is that they're going to be expected to do with it, and then they're expected to pony up additional affordable units or additional amenities, that's problematic and could send a signal that this is not a place where you're safe to invest. So it's how clear can you, it's what we've said several times, I think, ahead of time. It's like, it's the rules. The rules have got to be clear and people have got to know what to expect. And then you create the kind of investment climate where you're going to get developers who are
Can I
interested
make a
in
point
doing
along
what it
those
is you
lines?
want.
Make
Pardon
a
me?
point along those lines. I'm going to make a point along those lines. You know, one thing that density as well is simply an abstraction. It's neither good nor bad. It's the design that matters. And really the design really has a great deal to do with how you perceive the environment. So, you know, controls that guarantee good design and design quality have a tremendously positive impact, much more so than just the abstraction of density, I would say. And I think that's an important thing to remember in any kind of regulation.
And Matt, you just teed me up perfectly. I dropped a link in the chat as a resource to kind of wrap up this loop and to underpin my commentary. We did the report zone in. We talked to developers. They love form-based codes. They love the predictability of it. They love the objectivity of it. So it's very clear rules. And they found that the permitting process was like really fast, which saved them money. So all of that kind of goes back to the cost savings, which can then be wrapped back into the affordable housing that can be offered to residents. One more point, and I promise I'll stop because we're running short of time. Affordability is also a function of wages. And we're talking about regulations here because that's what we can control. But we can build as much housing supply as we want to. But if wages don't match with that housing supply, we'll still be in this problem. And DC does have a housing shortage at a variety of income levels.
Well, Toccarra, you're right. We are coming to the end of the time, and fortunately not going to be able to get to all the questions, I guess. But Cheryl, did you want to wrap up?
Yeah, I want to thank everybody for joining us. Ellen, thank you for moderating this, and Toccarra, we're so happy that you came to town, and I know you're doing national level work. It's such a joy to have you. You know, every time I run into you, I'm asking you about form-based code, and you're saying, oh, you know, you can do these kinds of things. So I appreciate you lending your evening and expertise to us. And Matt, Professor Bell, thank you so much for taking us back to medieval and beautiful Arab architecture for the building blocks of how we can think about designing our communities today. So we will and Worth Revision for co-sponsoring this. We're recording this and we will send out materials. Matt, I want your presentation if you can send that to me. And we'll post this on our website and share this out with everybody. And so thank you so much for joining us. And this is the beginning of a conversation. We want to have a lot more discussion about this. We think this is a really important discussion to have about as we look at rewriting our comprehensive plan over the next couple of years and our ongoing tasks of Wisconsin Avenue rezoning and planning for Rhode Island Avenue Northeast and other places in the city. So please keep coming back, and we're going to work this out together. Thank you. Have a great evening.
Great. Thanks all.